G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to IL-2 with Mags, and it is finally here. The ME262 has landed into Battle of Bodenplatte Early Access. So, the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first full production jet fighter. And it's an absolute beast of a thing to fly, but it is slightly different from all of the other IL-2 aircraft. Unlike the other aircraft in IL-2 Great Battles, the 262 doesn't have a fully automated start sequence. You do have to do a couple of things to get this thing rolling. Now, it's not overly complex, but you do need to get it right. So, for today's video, what we're going to do is fire up the engines, we're going to taxi it around, take off, go for a little bit of a fly, engage in a little bit of air-to-air combat, nothing too complex, just some AI bombers, and then we're going to bring it back to land. So, first things first, let's jump into the cockpit. Alright, so the cockpit is absolutely beautifully detailed, as you would expect of all of the Great Battles aircraft. Wonderful to look at, and the view out of the cockpit is amazing. But before we go into that, we're going to need to run over some of the gauges and some of the internals in here that we'll need during startup. And we'll actually take a look at the throttles here first. So, I'm going to gently bring the throttles up here just a little. Now, you see those two little tabs that just flick forward? That's the minimum operating position for the Jumo 004 B1 turbojet engines on the ME262. Now, once you're in flight, you will not be able to lower the throttles below that position. However, as we bring them forward during startup, you're looking for those tabs to click up in order to be able to start the engine. Now, I'm just going to do a quick pause here. Okay, so now we can quickly go over the engine instrumentation, which is everything on the right-hand side of the cockpit. Now, it's divided down the center. All the gauges on the left-hand side are gauges for the left-hand engine. All the gauges on the right are gauges for the right-hand engine. For startup, the two most important ones are the tachometers at the top. Now, these, of course, measure turbine RPM, and they are dual scale. So there is an inner scale that goes between 0 and 3000 RPM. When the needle strikes 3000 RPM on the inner ring, it will reset to the outer ring at the 3000 position, which is standard idle position for the Jumo 004 engines. Now, the next two directly below are your temperature gauges, specifically your exhaust gas temperature gauges. Now, these, well, they're important to keep an eye on, but you don't need to, constantly focus on them. Basically, through the startup, at idle, and in flight, the needles should sit up around about the 6 mark on the gauge for both of them. So providing they're sitting there, you're perfectly fine. However, if the temperatures suddenly rapidly drop off towards the 0, you've probably had an engine flame out, and you'll see this before you'll see the RPMs drop for the turbine. Likewise, if the needles suddenly spike up into the red, you've probably got an engine fire, and again, these gauges will let you know that before any of the other gauges will start to respond. So if the airplane suddenly feels wrong in flight, first place you should be looking at those temperature gauges to see what the needles are doing. If the needles are both still sitting in the nominal area, you're probably fine, at least in regards to engines. Something else is going on. The key time to really pay attention to these, however, is if you are in combat and you are rapidly moving the throttle, which you should only ever do above 6000 RPM, but I'll go into that a little bit later. And to be perfectly clear, you shouldn't be rapidly moving the throttle at any time regardless, but if you find yourself in need to, these are the two gauges you should be watching while doing it, just to make sure you're not going to do something horrendously stupid to your engines at a time when you really don't want it to happen. Anyways, your remaining gauges going from the top and down is your exhaust gas pressure, your oil pressure, and your fuel pressure, with your fuel gauges sitting directly underneath. Now, fuel gauges, pretty straightforward exactly what they're for. The rest, it's good to know what they are. I've honestly never looked at them in flight. Okay, so let's unpause. Now, the startup for the 262 in IL-2. First things first, you're going to hit the general engine start button. This is the same as every single other aircraft in IL-2. Now, what this is going to do is essentially get a ground start cart fired up with the starter motor on it that's going to start pre-spooling the engines. It'll start with the left-hand engine first, then the right-hand engine. Now, you're going to need to bind 2 additional buttons to start the 262, and these are press-to-hold engine igniters. So, let's hit the general engine start now. There we go. Start flipping on the electricals in the aircraft, and you'll hear the ground start cart fire up in just a second, and there it goes with what sounds like a tiny little 2-stroke. Now, you want to watch the tachometer for the left-hand engine. You'll see the needles start to increase. Once it passes 1000 RPM on the inner ring, which is just below the 6th position and about the 5.5 position on the outer ring, we're going to hit the engine start. And you have to press and hold. You can't just hit it, you've got to hold it. Okay, there we go. If you've got a Thrustmaster Warthog, this is really easy. You bind the engine start buttons to the fuel switches at the front top of the throttle, and because they're click and they hold, it makes this a lot easier. Alright, so as it passes 2000 RPM on the inner ring, we're going to bring the throttles forward until we see the little tab click up. That opens up the fuel valves, and the needle has swung around to 3000 RPM, and that engine is stable and running. So now with that engine running, the start cut is going to start firing up and spooling up the right-hand side engine. And needle is just starting to climb. Nearly at 1000. There we go. So again, press to hold. Now, as soon as the engines are started, I should mention you immediately stop holding the button, or you flick the flick your switch off for engine start. Once the fuel's applied and the tab's clicked up, you're good to let go. If you keep holding, let's bring up the fuel again and click. If you keep holding, you'll blow out the engine. And if you let go too early, the engine will fail to ignite and will need to spool all the way back down before you can start the process again. And there we have it. Both engines are up and running. Now, as I said, this isn't overly complex, but you have to get it right. It is entirely possible, if you mess it up, that you will blow up your engines while you're sitting on the ground. And that means you've got to respawn the aircraft and start again. Okay, so it's time to taxi the 262 out. So first things first, we've got to bring the engines up to 6000 RPM. Now, whatever you do, under no circumstances do you rapidly move the throttles below 6000 RPM. Even if you have the fuel regulator valve modification installed on the 262, do not move the throttles quickly below 6000. Doing so is a fantastic way of taking all of those nice shiny metal blades attached to your turbine and turning them into nothing more than metal confetti propelled by a gigantic explosion of fireball out the back of your engine. So yeah, don't do that. Now once you've got the engines up to 6000 RPM, you can be a little bit more aggressive with the throttle here. Again, you don't want to be too aggressive. 6000 however isn't enough to move the aircraft. Now this will depend on what kind of runway you're on. If you're on a paved runway with nice cement taxiways and a nice cement parking area, 6,500 is generally enough to get the 262 to start to roll. As you can see, this is a dirt runway with uneven terrain and uneven parking area, so about 7,500 was what it took to get it to roll. Once it starts to roll, back the engines off to between 6-6.5 just to maintain your roll. Now, taxiing the aircraft around, the 262 has no nose wheel steering. The nose wheel does turn, but you cannot steer directly with it. It's all differential braking, and the rudder is entirely useless for ground maneuvering at speeds below 50 kilometers an hour, so it's all on the brakes. And again, you wouldn't really want to use the engines to try and steer it either, so it's easy enough to get used to. If you just got to remember, if you do brake too heavily to one side, it's going to take a lot of brake to bring the nose back around to the other side, and if the wheel is, or the front wheel is not centered perfectly straight, the aircraft can veer off and will require little adjustments, or if the terrain's uneven, it will bounce the steering around a little bit. It's not too much of a major issue. Now, as I just said, this is a dirt runway. The 262 as a general rule likes paved runways, if possible, and it prefers longer runways. The best ones for the 262 in IL-2 on any of the maps are generally the ones that are sort of optimized for bombers. The runway we're taking off today is dirt, and it's technically too short for a 262 takeoff, which is precisely why I'm using it. Because you can take off and land from these runways, they're just a little bit hairier. Anyways, we're now lined up on the runway, right at the start, at the end of the taxiway, both brakes down, we're sitting at just around 6,000 RPM at this point, and it's going to take us pretty much this whole runway to take off. So first things first, let's get rid of the gun sight. There we go. Now, while holding the brakes on, we are going to start throttling up the engines. Generally, you would release the brakes at about 7,000 RPM, but dirt runway and a short runway at this, I'm going to let this spool up to about 7.5 and then release. And once we've released the brake, power all the way through to 100% on the throttles in a nice smooth movement, not too quick. And as I said before, god damn it, I wish I could turn those radio messages off. Anyways, as I said, the rudder is useless until you hit 50 kilometers an hour for steering. Once you hit 50, it's feet off the brakes. Use the rudder to steer and keep the nose level. Now, normally 20% flaps for takeoff. I've got about 30 because this is a short runway. And your rotational speed is normally at 200 kilometers an hour. I'm going to rotate at about 180 because I'm going to run out of runway on this particular one. Now, it's completely normal for the 262 not to lift off straight away. You've just got to hold this attitude for just a moment, and there we go. The wheels are up off the ground now. It'll very slowly lift off, and away we go. So, landing gear up. Now, you cannot operate the landing gear and the flaps at the same time. The hydraulics in the 262 are not powerful enough, so raise the landing gear first, then retract the flaps. And this is the point where, or the first point where 262s are rather vulnerable to being taken out by prop-driven aircraft. You're not going to be particularly fast off takeoff, and it will take time to build up speed. So pick an angle that's not going to be towards any particular hostile aircraft, level the nose out, build up some airspeed and level flight, and once you have enough airspeed, then start climbing off and doing what you need to do. And yes, it flies as smoothly and as beautifully as it looks. This thing is glorious to fly. Okay, so I was planning on just bringing it back for a landing at this point, but I know some shits will be cracked if I don't actually do some combat in this thing. So our victims for today are going to be a trio of Peshkas heading towards our runway. Now, a couple of things. As I mentioned before, you can be a little bit more liberal with your throttle movements above 6,000 RPM, particularly in combat if you need to. However, in this particular engagement, I'm actually going to be flying this in exactly the same fashion that the real pilots did. I'm not going to be touching the throttle at all at any point in this flight. Instead, I'm going to leave the throttles sitting at about 85-86%, and I'm just not going to touch them. I'm just going to leave them alone. And here comes our first victim. And that is one target down already. God, I love these guns. Okay, so 85-86%. Why did World War II ME-262 pilots fly the plane like this? Well, basically, even with the fuel regulators installed on, as was done with all of the later model 262s once they found the problem, moving the throttles was kind of unnecessary for the most part. Even with the regulators in, the rapid throttle movements could cause problems, as it can with the IL-2 version of the 262 as well, and 100% power was often too fast. The closing distance to enemy targets, or hostile targets, was so short that the amount of time that the pilots actually had to fire on the targets was just not enough for accurate shooting. Even at 85%, it was generally too fast anyway, which was a bit of a problem, but something the pilots did learn to deal with over time. And even at 85%, the 262 was still pretty much the fastest thing in the sky, so they didn't need to. It was much easier to set the throttles to 85 and just leave them there. 100% for takeoff, back them off to 85 once the aircraft had attained altitude and speed, and then just fly the plane. And that was a total miss then. I just could not see through the sun glare, so roll out. Reline back up on the targets. We're going to dip in underneath. They've got less guns underneath, which is why I'm making the valley approaches. Peshkas from above can be rather nasty. They've only got one gun down below, however, so And metal confetti. There we go. Yep, the damage level on these guns is absurd. It's great. Anyways, landing the 262, and again we're going to land on the same runway. It's a little bit short, but we can put it down regardless. So first things first, and this is another area where the 262 will be vulnerable, losing airspeed. It has no air brakes, so you've got to pull the engines back to about 6,000 RPM. You want to hold them at about there, and then just maintain level flight in a pattern around the airfield until you hit 300 kilometers an hour. Once you hit 300 kilometers an hour, you can then drop the landing gear. That's the maximum speed tolerance for the landing gear. Now, ideally, you'll do this on your final turn in for your landing approach. Once the landing gear has lowered, remember you can't operate the landing gear and the flaps at the same time, in the 262, drop the flaps to 100%. You want full flaps for landing. Now, your stall speed in landing configuration in the 262 is about 140 to 150 kilometers an hour. Your optimal touchdown speed is about 165 to 185 with a glide slope speed of about 250 kilometers an hour in descent. I turned back onto the runway a little bit too short and I'm a little bit too high on this particular run, so I'm actually closer to 260 in the glide slope, so I'm throttling back the engines earlier. Generally, you wouldn't throttle the engines back to idle until right before touchdown. I'm throttling them back now to try and arrest some of the speed that I'm still maintaining, even though I'm trying to bleed it off. And I'm going to do a little bit of a flare here towards the end just to kill the last of my speed. I'm still going to land a little bit too fast. My touchdown's going to be at about 200 kilometers an hour, but it's not too far out of the recommended and should be okay. And of course, once I'm wheels on ground, full on the brakes, don't push too much pressure forward on the stick. You don't want to load up the weight onto the front wheel all that much. And because I'm carrying a little bit of extra momentum here, I'm just going to run straight off the runway onto the taxiway and continue my turn around to head back to parking. And that's pretty much it. Once again, taxiing on the ground below 50 kilometers an hour, everything must be done with the differential braking. The rudder is absolutely useless for ground steering. And once you get the aircraft back to where you want to shut it down, the shutdown is the same as every other IL-2 aircraft. Just hit your main engine start button again, that'll shut down your engines, and you're done. Anyways, guys, that is the ME262 for IL-2 Great Battles, and it is a fantastic aircraft and one of the ones that I was waiting for. I've also been waiting for the Tempest and the P-38, of course. Unfortunately, they haven't arrived yet, but I'm hoping they'll arrive sooner rather than later. But it is fantastic fun to fly. It is so smooth. It is lethal. It does have a couple of quirks that you're going to have to spend a bit of time learning, and I do love the fact that because it's a jet and it is a bit different to everything else in IL-2, it does have sort of its own startup sequence that is unique to just it. I think that is fantastic. Anyways, guys, I hope you found this video useful. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, remember to click that like button if you do, share and subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies. Oh, also, check out the Magsware store. I put a English Electric Lightning piece up just the other day, and there'll be some more stuff sneaking up over the next week. Catch you soon.